Before Marcus Aurelius put on the purple robes of the most powerful man in the known world, before he walked into the Senate chamber, before he issued commands that moved armies, before he received petitions from people whose entire lives rested on his single word, he sat alone. In the quiet of the early morning, before the palace woke, before the advisors arrived, before the weight of an empire settled onto his shoulders like armor he never asked to wear, he wrote. Not letters, not decrees, not the administrative documents of a man managing the largest political entity the Western world had ever seen. He wrote to himself, reminders, confrontations, questions he forced himself to answer honestly before the day gave him the opportunity to avoid them. And those words, private, unpolished, never intended for any audience, became one of the most read documents in human history, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. But here is what most people miss when they read that book. They treat it as philosophy, as wisdom to be admired and occasionally quoted. Marcus did not write it to be admired. He wrote it as a morning practice, a daily discipline, a way of preparing his mind before the world arrived with everything it was going to demand from him. And the world demanded everything. Today we are going to look at exactly what Marcus did in those early hours, and what Epictetus, Seneca, and Cato taught about the morning as the most important battlefield of the day, not as history, as instruction. Because the same practice that made Marcus Aurelius unshakable in the middle of an empire in crisis is available to you this morning, before the world arrives with everything it is going to demand from you today. Stay with me. If you are someone who wants to start each day with the clarity, the groundedness, and the unshakable composure that the Stoics spent their lives building, subscribe to this channel. Every week we go deep into Stoic wisdom through real stories and timeless principles that help you face whatever the day brings without losing yourself in it. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Let's begin. 1. The morning Marcus Aurelius actually had. Imagine a man named Daniel. He is 53 years old, a regional director for a logistics company in Charlotte, North Carolina, who manages 42 people across 3 locations and begins every workday in the same way. His alarm goes off at 6:15. He reaches for his phone before his eyes are fully open. Emails from the overnight shift. A message from a client in a different time zone who needed something 3 hours ago. A notification from a news app that has decided, based on his reading history, that what he most needs at 6:15 in the morning is a curated selection of everything that is currently going wrong in the world. By 6:30, Daniel has been awake for 15 minutes and is already reactive, already behind, already inside someone else's agenda, already responding to a world that arrived in his bedroom before he had a single moment to decide who he was going to be today. He will spend the rest of the day catching up to a version of himself he never had the chance to prepare. Does this sound familiar? Now let us go back to Rome, to the 2nd century AD, to a man who woke up every morning with more demands on his attention than Daniel will face in a decade, and who had developed a practice for those first hours that made everything that followed possible. Marcus Aurelius was not, by nature, a morning person. He wrote about this directly and without flattery toward himself. He described the temptation to stay in bed, the pull of warmth and comfort, and the seductive argument that the work could wait just a little longer. He wrote to himself, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work and as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for?" He was not being harsh with himself. He was being precise. He had decided, before the alarm, before the obligations, before the empire arrived, what he was for, what his day was in service of, what kind of person he intended to be before the world had the opportunity to decide for him. And that decision, made in the quiet of the morning before anything else, was the foundation everything else was built on. He would begin by reading, not news, not correspondence, philosophy. The words of Epictetus, whose teachings he had encountered as a young man and returned to throughout his life. He read not for entertainment or information, but for the specific purpose of reminding himself of things he knew but would be tempted to forget the moment the day began. Then he would write, The entries in his meditations are not long. They are not polished. They are the writing of a man arguing with himself, catching the thoughts that were drifting in unhelpful directions and redirecting them before they had the chance to run his day. He wrote things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Not because he had forgotten this, but because the morning was his opportunity to make it felt rather than merely known, to move it from intellectual understanding into something that would actually govern his behavior when the Senate was difficult, or the general was insubordinate, or the petitioner was lying to his face. He was not reading philosophy, he was installing it. Daniel eventually made one change to his morning, a change so small it felt almost too small to matter. He stopped reaching for his phone first. Instead, for 20 minutes before anything else, he sat with a notebook, not journaling in the therapeutic sense, not recording his feelings or his gratitude lists. He wrote one thing every morning. What kind of person do I intend to be today? Not a goal, not a task list, a person. And then, briefly, specifically, what that person would do when the day got difficult, when the client was unreasonable, when the team fell short, when the pressure arrived, as it always did, before he was ready for it. He was doing imperfectly and without knowing its name what Marcus Aurelius had been doing in a tent on the Danube frontier 2,000 years earlier. He was preparing his interior before the exterior arrived, and the days that followed that preparation were not easier than the days before it. But Daniel moved through them differently, not because the problems had changed, because he had. Here is the first principle. The morning is not the beginning of your day. It is the foundation your day is built on. What you do in the first 30 minutes, before the phone, before the email, before the world arrives with its agenda, determines not what happens to you today, but who you are when it happens. Prepare your interior first. Everything else follows from that. 2. What Epictetus taught about the first hour. Now meet a woman named Caroline. She is 48 years old, a family law attorney in Denver, who has spent 20 years in one of the most emotionally demanding legal specialties that exists. She has sat across from people on the worst days of their lives. She has held the details of other people's pain with a professionalism that requires, from the inside, a kind of daily emotional management that most people in other professions never develop. She is exceptionally good at this, and she starts every morning in a state of low-grade emergency, not because anything is actually wrong at 6 in the morning, but because her nervous system, trained across 2 decades of genuine professional emergencies, has learned to manufacture the feeling of urgency in the absence of actual urgency. She wakes up tense. She moves through her morning routine tense. She arrives at the office tense. And then the actual demands of the day arrive and layer on top of the manufactured tension. And by 10 o'clock, she is operating from a place of chronic stress that has become so normalized she has stopped recognizing it as stress at all. She thinks this is just what her life feels like. It is not. It is what her mornings have trained her life to feel like. Now let us travel to ancient Nicopolis, to a small school on the northwestern coast of Greece where a former slave with a broken leg and no official credentials was teaching philosophy to students who traveled from across the empire to hear him speak. Epictetus had no morning routine in the conventional sense. He had no palace to wake up in, no calendar of appointments to prepare for. What he had was something more valuable, a philosophy of the first moment. He taught his students that the single most important skill a person could develop was what he called the discipline of assent, the practiced ability to pause between the first impression that arrived in the mind and the judgment that followed it. He wrote, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." In the context of the morning, this is revolutionary. The tension Caroline feels when she wakes up is not caused by her cases, her clients, or the genuine demands of her day. It is caused by the opinions she is already forming about those cases, those clients, and those demands before a single one of them has actually arrived. Her mind is running the day before the day exists, and Epictetus would have said, that is where the work begins. Not in managing the cases, not in optimizing the schedule, in the discipline of noticing the first impression, the rush of anticipated difficulty that arrives with consciousness each morning, and choosing deliberately what to do with it. He wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be and then do what you have to do." This is the Epictetan morning practice in a single sentence. Before you do anything, before you check the calendar, before you review the case files, before you think about the difficult client or the impossible deadline, say to yourself what you would be, not what you would accomplish, not what you would get through, what you would be. What quality of mind, what quality of attention, what quality of presence do you intend to bring to this day, regardless of what the day brings back? Caroline eventually built a practice around this. Simple, requiring nothing but 7 minutes and a willingness to be honest. She would sit before the coffee, before the phone, before the rehearsal of the day's demands that her mind wanted to begin immediately, and she would ask herself one question. Who am I before the day tells me who to be? And she would sit with that question until something in her settled. Not into happiness, not into false optimism about a day that was going to be genuinely difficult, into herself. The version of Caroline that existed before the cases arrived, before the clients arrived, before the manufactured urgency her nervous system had learned to produce on schedule. That version, present, grounded, clear, was available to her every morning. She had simply never given it the 7 minutes it needed to establish itself before everything else rushed in. The days that followed those 7 minutes were not less demanding, but Caroline moved through them from a different starting point, not behind the day always catching up. Inside it, present, herself. Here is the second principle. The first hour of your day is being spent on something. The question is whether you are choosing what it is spent on, or whether the accumulated momentum of your habits, your phone, and your nervous system's learned patterns are choosing for you. Ask yourself, before anything else arrives, who you are before the day tells you who to be. 7 minutes, one question. Everything that follows is built on the answer. 3. Seneca and the practice of preparation. Imagine a man named Raymond. He is 61 years old, a recently retired civil engineer from a mid-sized city in Tennessee who spent 34 years solving structural problems with the kind of methodical, patient, evidence-based thinking that built bridges and overpasses, and the quiet infrastructure of a city that mostly takes his work for granted. He was good at this because he was thorough. Before he committed to a design, he stress-tested it. Before he signed off on a structure, he had already imagined every way it could fail and built the failure points into his calculations. He did not do this because he was pessimistic. He did it because a bridge that has been imagined failing is safer than a bridge that has only been imagined succeeding. He is now applying none of this thinking to his own days. Raymond retired 14 months ago, and the mornings that he imagined would feel like freedom, open, unscheduled, entirely his own, have become something he did not anticipate. They feel formless, without the structure of work, without the calendar that organized his attention, without the professional identity that told him what each day was for. Raymond wakes up and feels a low-level anxiety that he cannot attribute to anything specific. He has everything he worked for, the time, the freedom, the absence of obligation, and he does not know what to do with himself before 9 o'clock. Now let us go to ancient Rome, to a man who understood the relationship between the morning and the mind with a precision that feels, 2,000 years later, remarkably clinical. Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, a playwright, a political advisor, and eventually, under Nero's reign, a man who lived every day with the knowledge that his death could arrive at the emperor's pleasure without warning. He wrote his greatest work in this shadow, and what he wrote about mornings, specifically about the practice he called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, is the most practically useful thing any Stoic ever put on paper. He wrote to his friend Lucilius, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." He was not being morbid, he was being strategic. Seneca had discovered, through years of practicing it himself, that a morning spent briefly and honestly imagining the difficulties the day might bring produced something counterintuitive. not more anxiety, less. Because the anxiety Caroline feels, and the formlessness Raymond experiences, and the reactive behindness that Daniel starts his day inside, all of them share a common root. The day arrives and surprises the mind. The difficult client is not anticipated. The uncomfortable conversation is not prepared for. The moment of frustration or disappointment or confusion catches the mind in an unprepared state, and the reaction that follows is therefore ungoverned, shaped by the surprise rather than by the person's actual values and intentions. Seneca's practice eliminated the surprise, not by predicting the future, by acknowledging its uncertainty. He would sit in the morning and think specifically about what might be difficult today, not catastrophizing, not spiraling into worst-case thinking, but honestly, briefly, with the precision of a civil engineer stress-testing a structure, imagining the points where the day might apply pressure, and then asking, who do I want to be at that pressure point? Not, how do I avoid it? Not, how do I make it not happen? Who do I want to be when it happens? Because it will happen. Something today will apply pressure, something will test the composure you are trying to build, something will arrive, a person, a piece of news, a conversation, and reach for a reaction from you. Seneca's morning practice was the practice of deciding in advance what that reaction would be. Raymond eventually built his own version of this. Every morning, before the formlessness had a chance to settle into anxiety, he would spend 10 minutes doing what he had spent 34 years doing professionally. Stress testing the day. He would think about what was ahead, not the calendar. He was retired. The calendar was blessedly thin. But the texture of the day, the phone call he had been putting off, the conversation with his adult daughter that had been circling unresolved for weeks, the decision about his health he had been avoiding, he would think about each one briefly, honestly, and then he would ask himself, with the same methodical patience he had brought to every structural problem in his career, what would a man I respect do here? Not what would be easiest, not what would avoid conflict. What would a person of the character he was trying to build actually do? And then he would go do that. The formlessness dissolved, not because the days became structured, but because Raymond arrived in them with a structure he carried inside himself, a set of prepared responses to the pressure points the day was likely to apply. He was not behind the day anymore, he was inside it, ready. Here is the third principle. Spend 10 minutes every morning briefly and honestly imagining what today might demand from you, and deciding in advance who you intend to be when it does. Not pessimism, preparation. The mind that has already visited the difficult moment is calmer inside it than the mind that arrives there by surprise. Prepare for the day before the day arrives. The version of you that walks into a prepared day is a fundamentally different person than the version that is perpetually ambushed by it. 4. The body. The Stoics insisted on. Now meet a woman named Patricia. She is 57 years old, a high school principal in a suburb of Minneapolis, who has spent 25 years managing the organized chaos of secondary education with the particular energy of someone who has never quite run out of it. She is the first person in the building every morning, not because the job requires it, because she needs those 20 minutes before the students arrive, before the noise and the needs and the administrative demands begin, to feel like herself before she becomes the role. She stands in the empty hallways and drinks her coffee, and does something she has never described to anyone because she is not sure she has the words for it. She remembers why she is here, not in a grandiose sense, not in a speech. She just, briefly, privately, while the hallways are still quiet, touches the reason underneath the role. She has been doing this for 25 years without knowing it had a name. The Stoics called it ascesis, practice, the deliberate cultivation of the self through repeated, disciplined physical and mental action. And they were insistent, in a way that surprises people who think of Stoicism as purely a philosophy of the mind, that the body was part of the morning practice, not athletically, not as optimization or performance enhancement, but as preparation. Epictetus wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And mastery of the self, for Epictetus, began with mastery of the body's morning impulses, the pull toward comfort, toward delay, toward the warmth of the bed, and the avoidance of the day's demands. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this specific battle almost guiltily, as though confessing to a weakness he had not yet fully conquered. Is it your profession to be in bed, or to be active and vigorous? Don't you see the little plants, the little birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees working together to put in order their part of the universe? And will not you do your part as a human being? He was not writing about exercise in the modern sense. He was writing about the act of getting up, of choosing engagement over retreat as the first decision of the day. Raymond eventually built his own version of this. Every morning, before the formlessness had a chance to settle into anxiety, he would spend 10 minutes doing what he had spent 34 years doing professionally: stress testing the day. He would think about what was ahead, not the calendar. He was retired. The calendar was blessedly thin. But the texture of the day, the phone call he had been putting off, the conversation with his adult daughter that had been circling unresolved for weeks, the decision about his health he had been avoiding, he would think about each one briefly, honestly, and then he would ask himself, with the same methodical patience he had brought to every structural problem in his career, what would a man I respect do here? Not what would be easiest, not what would avoid conflict. What would a person of the character he was trying to build actually do? And then he would go do that. The formlessness dissolved, not because the days became structured, but because Raymond arrived in them with a structure he carried inside himself, a set of prepared responses to the pressure points the day was likely to apply. He was not behind the day anymore, he was inside it, ready. Here is the third principle. Spend 10 minutes every morning briefly and honestly imagining what today might demand from you, and deciding in advance who you intend to be when it does. Not pessimism, preparation. The mind that has already visited the difficult moment is calmer inside it than the mind that arrives there by surprise. Prepare for the day before the day arrives. The version of you that walks into a prepared day is a fundamentally different person than the version that is perpetually ambushed by it. 4. The body. The Stoics insisted on. Now meet a woman named Patricia. She is 57 years old, a high school principal in a suburb of Minneapolis, who has spent 25 years managing the organized chaos of secondary education with the particular energy of someone who has never quite run out of it. She is the first person in the building every morning, not because the job requires it, because she needs those 20 minutes before the students arrive, before the noise and the needs and the administrative demands begin, to feel like herself before she becomes the role. She stands in the empty hallways and drinks her coffee, and does something she has never described to anyone because she is not sure she has the words for it. She remembers why she is here, not in a grandiose sense, not in a speech. She just, briefly, privately, while the hallways are still quiet, touches the reason underneath the role. She has been doing this for 25 years without knowing it had a name. The Stoics called it ascesis, practice, the deliberate cultivation of the self through repeated, disciplined physical and mental action. And they were insistent, in a way that surprises people who think of Stoicism as purely a philosophy of the mind, that the body was part of the morning practice, not athletically, not as optimization or performance enhancement, but as preparation. Epictetus wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And mastery of the self, for Epictetus, began with mastery of the body's morning impulses, the pull toward comfort, toward delay, toward the warmth of the bed, and the avoidance of the day's demands. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this specific battle almost guiltily, as though confessing to a weakness he had not yet fully conquered. Is it your profession to be in bed, or to be active and vigorous? Don't you see the little plants, the little birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees working together to put in order their part of the universe? And will not you do your part as a human being? He was not writing about exercise in the modern sense. He was writing about the act of getting up, of choosing engagement over retreat as the first decision of the day. The decision that set the tone for every decision that followed. The Stoics walked. Not as fitness practice, but as thinking practice. Marcus walked in the early morning and used the movement to organize his thoughts before committing them to the page. Seneca described walking as the activity most conducive to philosophical clarity, the body in motion freeing the mind from the particular paralysis that comes from sitting still with difficult questions. Cato the Younger was famously indifferent to physical comfort. He walked barefoot in cold weather not as performance, but as a daily reminder that discomfort was survivable, that the body's protest against difficulty was not a reliable indicator of actual danger. He was stress-testing his own comfort threshold every morning before anyone else was watching. Patricia's 20 minutes in the empty hallway was her version of this. The coffee, the quiet, the deliberate act of standing in the space before it filled with noise and need. She was not meditating in any formal sense. She was not following a protocol. She was doing what the Stoics insisted was essential and what most people skip entirely, giving her body and her mind a transitional space between the private self and the public role. Not because the role was bad, the role was her vocation, but because a person who walks into their role having first touched the self underneath it, that person brings something to the role that a person who goes from alarm clock to obligation in 14 minutes cannot bring. Presence. Genuine, grounded, chosen presence. Here is the fourth principle. Give your body a morning practice that is not about optimization or performance. Walk. Stand in a quiet space. Sit with your coffee before you open anything. Give yourself a transition between the private self and the public role. Not because the role is less important, because the self underneath the role is what makes the role worth anything. The person who arrives at their day, having first arrived at themselves, that person brings something that no amount of productivity optimization can manufacture. They bring the actual them, and the actual them is always the most valuable thing in any room. 5. The morning that changes everything. Finally, there is a man named William. He is 64 years old and he is what this entire video has been building toward, not because his mornings are perfect, not because he has found the optimal routine that eliminates difficulty and produces consistent peak performance, but because William has built a morning practice that has become, over 15 years of daily repetition, simply the way he begins. Not a protocol he follows, a person he is. He spent 30 years as a commercial litigation attorney, a profession that required him to be sharp, precise, and prepared in a way that left no room for the kind of interior work the Stoics were describing. He was excellent at the external preparation, the case files, the depositions, the arguments constructed and refined until they were as strong as he could make them. And he was, for most of those 30 years, hollowed out by 9 o'clock every morning before the first deposition had even begun, because he was preparing everything except himself. He retired at 62. And in the first months of that retirement, in the quiet that arrived where 30 years of professional urgency had been, he found a book he had been given years earlier and never opened, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He read it expecting philosophy. He found instructions, not for governing an empire, for governing a morning. He read about the practice of beginning the day with an acknowledgement of difficulty, not as pessimism, but as preparation. He read about the discipline of the first impression, the Epictetan practice of pausing between what arrives in the mind and what the mind does with it. He read about Seneca's insistence that time is the only resource that cannot be recovered, and that each morning is the opportunity to decide whether today's hours will be spent on what actually matters. And he built a practice, not from a self-help book, not from a productivity system, from the actual words of men who had lived inside genuine difficulty and found a way to begin each day without being consumed by it. William wakes at 5:30. He does not touch his phone. He makes coffee and he sits in the same chair at the same window for 30 minutes. The first 10 minutes he reads, not news, a single page of something worth thinking about. Marcus, Epictetus, Seneca, sometimes a poem, sometimes a passage from a biography of someone who faced difficulty with more grace than he managed the day before. The second 10 minutes he writes, 3 things only. What he is grateful for, not as a ritual, but as a genuine recalibration of his attention toward what is present rather than what is absent. What he is prepared to meet today, the specific difficulty, the specific conversation, the specific pressure point he knows the day will apply, and how he intends to meet it. What he wants to be today, not what he wants to accomplish, what he wants to be, patient, clear, honest, present, whatever the day seems to require most. The third 10 minutes he walks, not far, not fast, around the block in whatever weather the morning has decided to produce, because the body in motion after 30 minutes of stillness produces a quality of mental clarity that sitting cannot. And then, only then, he opens the phone, the email, the calendar, the world. But he opens it as himself, not as a reactive, unprepared, behind-the-day version of himself that the morning ambushed into existence, as the person he decided to be before the world arrived. That is what Marcus Aurelius was doing in the tent on the Danube frontier. That is what Epictetus was teaching in the small school in Nicopolis. That is what Seneca was describing in the letters to Lucilius. They were not describing a morning routine. They were describing a daily practice of self-construction, the deliberate, repeated, unglamorous act of building the person you intend to be. Before the day has the opportunity to build a version of you it finds more convenient. William describes his morning not as the best part of his day, though it often is, but as the part that makes the rest of the day possible. Not easier, possible. Because a person who has arrived at themselves before the world arrives, that person has something the world cannot give and cannot take. They have a starting point that belongs to them. Here is the fifth principle. Your morning is not a routine. It is a daily act of self-construction. Read something worth thinking about. Write something worth knowing about yourself. Move your body in a way that transitions you from the private self to the public day. 30 minutes, 3 things every morning. Not because it will make your day perfect, because it will make you present for it. And a person who is genuinely present, grounded, prepared, arrived at themselves before anything else has arrived, that person does not just have better days, they have a better life. Because a life is made of days, and days are made of mornings. Build the morning right, everything else follows.